117 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. But as always, we start by acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And I want to express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands that they've stewarded since time immemorial. Before we begin, I would like to ask that all in-person participants read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. And you'll notice that the microphones are a little bit different than they were prior to the summer. And so just make sure that you toggle the appropriate language before we get started here. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. All witnesses have completed the required connections tests in advance of this meeting. And I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking, and all comments should be addressed through the chair. Members, please raise your hands if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom, and the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nation lands. And just so you know, we will have time for committee business at the end of this meeting as well. With that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses that we have here today. We have Mr. John Paul, the Executive Director of the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs Secretariat. We have Vice Chief David Pratt from the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. And we have from the First Nations Advisory Committee on Safe Drinking Water, Mr. John Brown in person and Miss Emily Wittung McInnes online as well. So with that, we are going to get into the introductory remarks for each of the three witnesses, starting with Mr. Paul. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the committee for providing an opportunity to provide direct input into this very important piece of federal legislation. I work on behalf of 33 elected First Nation chiefs across Atlantic Canada and the Gaspé in Quebec. Our not-for-profit organization has been in place for over 30 years, and our organization is a policy research organization that analyzes and develops culturally alternatives to federal policies which impact on our Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Innu, and Passamaquoddy communities and people. Our chiefs and staff work to develop a strong voice for all our communities and people. The development of this legislation has taken a long time, and our chiefs have been involved since the beginning of the discussions with the expert panel on safe drinking water for First Nations and the report completed in November 2006. Our chiefs have always supported the idea of a clear legislative and regulatory regime to ensure equality in the provision of safe drinking water to all our communities and the safe disposal of wastewater. This was the only way in which our First Nations would be equals to non-Indigenous communities across Canada. Both detailed legislation and comprehensive regulations are needed to ensure there is a direct connection with the supply of water to the taps in every home in all our communities. We clearly remember the crisis which occurred after the Walkerton tragedy in 2010 and the actions by all governments to ensure standards were followed by all communities across Canada, including First Nations. Our chiefs believe it is important to remind everybody why we are here at this point today. Water to our people and communities is an important part of our traditions and culture and has been important since time immemorial. Our people have used it to survive and had traditional ways to ensure water was safe for their use in all communities. In the modern context, this has not changed, and all our communities want safe drinking water for all our people. I would like now to outline some key aspects of the legislation which could be improved. First Nations water quality is currently unregulated. Bill C-6061 allows First Nations to create their own regulations for water and wastewater quality, which at the minimum must align with the guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality and either the wastewater system effluent regulations or provincial standards. The wastewater regulations must consider environmental risk assessment of the receiving water body. Our chief support water and wastewater regulations as a regulatory framework supports operational and design conditions for our First Nations conditions consistent with non-Indigenous communities. However, regulations developed under C-30 must be met with adequate funding. With the key First Nation standards that are identified within the legislation, our chiefs in cooperation with the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority communicated that it will be necessary for Indigenous Services Canada to develop in partnership with First Nations a comprehensive funding framework within the first year of the Act achieving royal assent. Section 27.5 states that the minister must make best efforts to begin consultations on a funding framework within 6 months of the section coming into force. This is encouraging. However, while there is a mandate to start the work, there is no required deadline to finish it. Our committees believe there must be a commitment to finalize the funding framework within 2 years of the legislation meeting royal assent. It is essential. Further to funding, if a First Nation creates standards above the guidelines of Canadian drink water quality or wastewater system effluent regulations, the funding must provide adequate funding to the design, install, operate, maintain, and operate the infrastructure required to meet those standards. Having said that, I must emphasize the need for adequate funding for operations and maintenance on an ongoing basis. Additionally, increased treatment processes require advanced operator training. We must look forward for 20 to 25 years in the future as the need for safe drinking water will still exist. More importantly, Section 27.2G identifies enforcement as an important element to be considered in the funding framework. Today, there is no precedent for enforcing regulations regarding water services in First Nations, and Section 24 enables the minister or a provincial, territorial, or municipal government or any public body acting under the authority of the First Nation to enforce First Nations bylaw, or preferably a First Nation designed and led enforcement body. It is unclear what the actual cost of
Mr. Paul, sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up here, if you could. I'm sorry, we're over time.
Okay.
If you could just wrap it up, and then we'll have more time for questions as well.
Okay. Finally, we're encouraged to note standards developed must apply to both individual and decentralized systems. And it is essential that all systems in all communities must be included under the regulatory regime. To exclude people within your own community from safe drinking water is a system that doesn't work. We need a system that works, and we need the funding to ensure that there are no gaps and holes in the system for the provision of water and the disposal of wastewater. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. Next, we have, joining by video conference, Vice Chief David Pratt. You have 5 minutes for introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, as well as the clerk and all the committee members today. I'll get right into my statement today so we can get right into discussion and questions. Thank you all today for the time. I want to acknowledge the beautiful unceded, unsurrendered Treaty 4 territory that I'm calling from in the city of Regina today. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, members of the INAN committee, staff, my fellow presenters, and those observing in person and online. On behalf of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, which represents the 74 First Nations Saskatchewan in Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, I bring greetings and express my thanks at being given the opportunity to speak on Bill C-61. The FSIN supports federal legislation respecting First Nations drinking water, wastewater, and source water. However, we have concerns regarding the Act in its present form. I will note that it has been improved significantly since it was introduced in February 2023, but there is more that needs to be done. The recommendations in the paper we submitted earlier are based on the position held in our territories since the signing of the numbered treaties and is entirely consistent with UNDRIP. UN Covenant on Human Rights, the 1982 Constitution Act, the 1763 Royal Proclamation. We hold that as an equal partner in treaty, our nations remain sovereign and should be rightfully acknowledged in the current context as an order of government, alongside the federal and provincial governments. Functionality, this means our job here is to work towards sharing jurisdiction and powers within a cooperative confederation built on reconciliation. This position has been described as treaty federalism. It should be noted that the Constitution Act says nothing on the structure of federalism, only that Canada is the creation of our interlocked rights, sovereign rights and powers of First Nations, which are the basis for all treaty agreements, form the oldest foundation of the Constitution. This is why we call certain sections of C-61 a legislative overreach. The Aboriginal treaty rights in Section 35 include self-determination. We determine our path. Bill C-61 says Canada affirms First Nations' right to self-government and jurisdiction, that imposes layers of federal law that narrows our jurisdiction until there is very little room to move. None of this has anything to do with drinking water and should be taken out. Fresh water will become highly valuable in the near future, and we see the legislative overreach in C-61 as part of a larger strategy by Canada to strengthen their decision-making over water. We understand this strategy includes the Canada Water Agency and the modernization of the Canada Water Act. However, the paltering that has occurred to draw attention away from the connection between C-61 and these other initiatives raises concern that an additional motive of the strategy is to limit our rights, especially given the overreach described in the paper. Section 35 means that any discussions regarding source water protection or interjurisdictional agreements should occur at treaty tables on a nation-to-nation basis, not through a policy process administered by the Canada Water Agency, which seems to be implied in Section 6.1b. As your treaty partner, we remind Canada our relationship already contains collaborative processes that can be used to reach durable agreements. When this bill was first discussed, it was in the context of fulfilling Canada's fiduciary duty and preventing another water crisis. If this is still the case, then the use of the best efforts clause and sections relating to funding must be amended. It has nothing more than create a loophole that undermines the entire intent and purpose of the Act. If Canada truly wants to affirm our Section 35 rights and jurisdiction as stated in the preamble, it will provide us with the proper resources to develop and assert our own laws and not impose their own beyond what is necessary to ensure proper wastewater and freshwater services for all First Nations and prevent crises. This would be a positive step towards reconciliation.
Cela va d'être un pas important pour la communauté. Merci de m'avoir écouté, chers membres du comité. Merci au personnel. Merci à mes collègues et bonne chance.
Thank you very much, Vice Chief Pratt.
Merci, Monsieur Pratt. Est-ce que vous entendez bien l'interprétation?
Oui.
Nous allons maintenant passer au troisième témoin.
I understand Chief Emerita Tong McInnes is going to be providing 5 minutes for opening remarks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Miigwech. Anin Kinawaya, Gijab Dishnikaz, Ashkikamon Gimandao. Good afternoon, Chair, Committee. I'm joined today by John Brown, who's in the room with you. My name is Emily Wheatung, and I am the former Chief Emerita of Curve Lake First Nation and the Chair of the First Nations Advisory Committee on Safe Drinking Water. I'm also one...
Je représente les Autochtones dans un accord collectif. J'ai une demande à formuler aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire, s'il vous plaît, ne politisez pas l'accès aux Premières Nations. L'interprète devra être interrompu à l'heure actuelle car il n'y a pas de canal français.
The legislation that you're considering relates to a subsection of Canadians whose human rights have been ignored for too long. You've heard this sentiment before. You've maybe even seen it in the media. But I'd like to take these first few moments and tell you what this means on a personal level. It means that when I became a mother in 2014, I had to make sure that the bathwater didn't go in my children's mouth because it might make them sick. It means that as they got older, I had to take extra time and coordination, extra money and energy to get bottled water to make their food safe. It means that all of their beautiful baby, infant, pastel-covered clothes became gray and worn and brown because the water we washed with was so full of sedimentation that their baby clothes were discolored. My babies struggled with eczema and skin rashes, which I can only assume is a result of the water issues we faced. And my community doesn't have the worst drinking water in Canada. It means eventually I paid over $10,000 personally to have the water issues I faced fixed. Please understand, I say fixed, but this system did not eliminate these issues. It simply made the water drinkable and slowed down the wear and deterioration of our clothing and appliances. These are the everyday struggles of Indigenous people across Canada. I want to share with you that my First Nation is not remote. It's not in the north. It's 3 or 4 hours west and south of Ottawa, where you sit now. My grandfather lived to be 99, and he passed away in 2021. He would sit by the lake and tell my children and I the stories of how clear and clean the water was when he was young, how you could drink it from the lake, his memories of our family being healthy and well. And when I was a child, he had a water treatment system installed in his home in order to provide for his family. It's a big family. He had 13 children. Everyone who lived nearby would come to his house in the evenings or on weekends with water jugs to fill them up. And while it made him proud to be able to take care of us in this way, it's heartbreaking to think that in Southern Ontario, this had to happen. I'll say it again, I'm here today with one request. Help Bill C-61 make its way through the legislative process. Help First Nations take the first steps towards positive legislation that provides access to clean drinking water. At the very least, move this legislation forward to meet the minimum obligations of the Class Action Settlement Agreement. In my culture, time and attention are a gift, and I would like to express my gratitude for the gift that you've given all of us today with your time and attention. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for your opening comments. And before we're going to proceed to the first 6-minute round of questioning, I understand there's been some discussions amongst the parties about a motion and there's unanimous consent, but I want to turn it over to Mr. Carr to present the said motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies to our witnesses. I don't want to take too much time away from this matter at hand, but very quickly, as the sole representative in this table for Manitoba, I wanted to put forward the following motion just in light of the passing of Grand Chief Cathy Merrick, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. I've run this by the leaders of all parties around the table, but I'll read it as follows. Mr. Chair, that in light of the sudden passing of Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Grand Chief Cathy Merrick on September 6th, 2024, the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs offers its deepest condolences to her family, friends, and community. The committee acknowledges her tireless efforts in leadership, particularly her advocacy for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and pledges to honor her dedication to improving the lives of First Nations people through its ongoing work. Furthermore, that the committee report this to the House. So, Mr. Chair, because I did not have the chance to present this with 48 hours notice, I do need unanimous consent in order to move the motion. My hope is that we will receive that, and following that, we can quickly vote to adopt this motion and get back to the important topic at hand vis-a-vis Bill C-61. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. I see we have our welcome, Mr. Angus, to our committee today. I just want to recognize you and what you might want to add to this.
Thank
And I'm certainly, this study of water is super important. It's something that in the communities I represent, we struggle with, and the indignities and injustice have to be addressed. But I want to take just a few moments for my colleague, Mr. Carr, on this motion of recognizing the loss of Grand Chief Merrick, who was a real trailblazer and whose sudden death, I think, shocked everybody. And I think it's really important that these moments that we come together across party lines, at these moments we recognize the people and the women who are leading the way for Indigenous justice in this country. And I would like to fully support, on behalf of the New Democratic Party, my colleague's motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angus. Monsieur Lemire, je vais vous donner la parole.
The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Bloc would also like to support the MP Carr's motion. We'd like to underline the fact that Great Chief Merrick was very committed to working for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, was very honest and extremely engaged. So we'd like to recognize our respect for this individual and their family. Thank you very much.
Beaucoup.
Thank you.
Monsieur Shields, Mr. Shields, I see you have your microphone on
Nope.
there. Okay.
New microphone.
Okay, great. Will this option or this motion be adopted by unanimous consent? Great. Motion adopted.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
With that, we will get into the first round of questioning, starting with the Conservatives. Mr. Shields, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the witnesses being here today in person and with video. My first question would go to Vice Chief David Pratt, who's with us on video conference. In your media release dated December 11, 2023, you state, the proposed act announced today would force First Nations into more negotiations with the provincial government, who must agree to any protection plan. Of particular concern is this proposed legislation is the section that allows Canada and the provincial and territorial governments to make agreements regarding First Nations water by themselves. Well, it says the minister must consult with First Nations on these agreements. The law does not require First Nations to approve any agreement as it does the provinces on source water. So, Chief Pratt, Vice Chief Pratt, do you believe the legislation can guarantee that First Nations, the federal government, provinces must come to an agreement before any regulations would come into force?
Well, as I said, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honorable member for your question today. Appreciate that. And definitely one of the biggest concerns that we have in this agreement is that when it comes to source water, we would have to negotiate an agreement with the province or territory that we're in regarding that. Our position here at the Federation that's been long withstanding since our founding in 1948 is that, First Nations have jurisdiction over their lands, resources, territory, etc. And we feel that the legislation kind of boxes us into where we become more of a policy rather than a rights-driven position on water. And that's one of the biggest concerns that we have with it. So definitely concerns around that wording in the legislation. And as I said earlier, my opening statement, we are not against any type of federal water legislation. We just want to ensure that, number one, rights are respected, but two, that it actually ends the boil water advisories and provides the adequate resources and funding, which is why I raised the best efforts clause inside the legislation, because then successive governments are only allowed to give their best efforts. That wording leaves it pretty wide open and doesn't really guarantee the successive governments, not just the current one, will be able to commit to the statutory funding that's required to adequately address clean drinking water within First Nations. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that part. And I think one of the challenges of legislation is to write it vaguely but with enough structure in it. But this leaves it pretty wide open for the regulations. So the federal government can write the regulations, and it doesn't have to give your consent to those regulations. is that something that's going to be problematic?
Definitely there, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question again. Definitely it will be a problem because I will probably be impeached and lose my job if I agree to that. Because if they're allowed to proceed without our consent and without what's that legal term, our acquiesce, there's going to be problems. So I think the jurisdictional questions, we do have a precedent already in federal legislation with the Act respecting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. And I would like to see us go along down that same line in recognition of First Nations jurisdiction in this country. And I think that it's not too much we're asking for. We would like that respect, and I think it needs to be given in an era of reconciliation, in an era of, it's 2024, like the colonial office closed 150 years ago. So I think it's time to really put First Nations in the driver's seat and recognize that jurisdiction. And also, it puts the pressure on the provinces and territories to negotiate with us in good faith. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I think that's an excellent comment when you suggest that the cooperation between the three levels of government that we're talking about here, if we don't get consent agreement with all parties, this legislation is going to be severely limiting in what you would expect it to bring to you.
Exactly, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
To Mr. Paul, one of the questions that we might have with this legislation is protection zones. For you, do you have an understanding in this legislation what protection zones would mean?
Not really, but I know that if the regulatory regime is written clearly enough with full inclusion and participation of First Nation perspectives, that will protect our interests and bring clarity to whatever part of the legislation. It will be the threads that creates the mesh for the legislation, basically, for our communities.
So at this point, you don't have what you would call a definition of what a protection zone would be? No. Okay. I would go back to the Vice Chief Pratt. Do you have a definition or an idea of what protection zones would be for you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that question. Definitely, I believe that I would have to agree with Mr. Paul on that. I think that it leaves too much ambiguity in terms of not a clear definition on that. And those are, and I know, I get that every piece of federal legislation has that issues. It's not, every piece of federal legislation is not a perfect piece of legislation, but I think when it comes to clean drinking water and the class action and all of the issues that we've had with that, we have to ensure that we're not just allowing the status quo to continue, and that there actually is a change when it comes to this. Part of our mandate here at the Federation is to pass our own pieces of regional water legislation to govern ourselves in terms of how those processes will work. So, Mr. Chair, to answer the question, I believe that it leaves that process too ambiguous and too open with not enough clarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. Next up in the 6-minute round, we'll be turning the floor over to Ms. Atwin virtually. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my fellow committee members and our witnesses for joining us today. It's back to school in the House of Commons, which means back to work. But First Nations have been waiting far too long for this legislation and for action around clean drinking water. And so I've been very eagerly awaiting today's meeting, and I'm very grateful for our witnesses for putting forward, again, incredible recommendations that we've certainly taken note of. I'd like to specifically shout out as well Chief Witang McGuinness. Thank you for situating women's voices and children in all of this. I think those are the stories that really break through and really present the reality of what people have been experiencing. And I certainly, want to underline as well your caution to not politicize this. This is a nonpartisan issue that all of us should deeply care about. And I know that my fellow members of the committee are all here for the right reasons. And so I look forward to getting through this work, getting through clause by clause, and getting to that royal assent, but in a form that works for everyone and works for communities. So I'd like to actually start, with the First Nation Advisory Committee. What's the role specifically, and what did that consultation or engagement process look like with regards to this legislation? John, do you want to answer that from a technical perspective?
Certainly, then you can speak to it as the chair. The First Nations Advisory Committee was created by the class action settlement, and its mandate is, among other things, to canvass and represent the views of First Nations across the country. Its membership is made up of Indigenous persons from across the country, and the mandate is to help provide advice to the federal government on what priorities it should look to, both in terms of asset allocation, funding, and the types of water infrastructure that should be provided to First Nations. That's mandate number one. Mandate number two is to oversee and help monitor the process, this very process, i.e. the repeal of the former Water Act and the replacement of it with this Water Act, which in simple terms means ensuring that this Water Act meets the needs of the First Nations and also meets the terms and conditions that Canada's already agreed to in the class action settlement itself, both by way of written agreement and by way of court orders enforcing that agreement. So I'm the Executive Director of the First Nations Advisory Committee. Chief Wheaton is the chair of the committee itself, and I'll turn it over to her now to answer the question from her perspective.
I don't know that I have a whole lot more to add, John. I think that was very succinct. But we also provide support to Chief Pratt's point on the governance of First Nations internally and support on that work as well. Thank you.
Great, and really picking up on what Vice Chief Pratt was mentioning. So several previous witnesses have also raised concerns around provincial jurisdiction when it comes to source water protection. So I'm very interested in perhaps strengthening this piece of the bill. Do you think the formal recognition of First Nations' inherent rights over water will strengthen this position when dealing with provinces? Chief Wheaton or Chief Vice Chief Pratt as well?
Absolutely.
Yep.
I think recognizing the inherent rights of Indigenous people always helps strengthen that process and is absolutely necessary.
I concur with Chief, and I want to thank Chief too, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Chief too for her comments that she brought earlier, and I also want to thank the honourable member too that started off with a recognition of Grand Chief Kathy Merrick too. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our hearts go out to her family. And in general as well for the First Nation Advisory Committee, your members deal with provincial governments of all political stripes. Have you seen any interest from provinces to work with you on water protections? Are these conversations already ongoing?
I answer from the perspective of the Executive Director. No, we've not seen any reach out by any provincial governments to our committee to deal with these issues. Perhaps Chief Wheaton has a different perspective as chair.
Nope. No different perspective.
Okay, and do you think if there were perhaps in the bill an arrangement that required the federal government to convene a roundtable or something of that sort to discuss protection zones at the request of a specific First Nation as a way to make sure that all future governments could fulfill these responsibilities? So something that ensures that this is ongoing regardless of, the political stripes.
Chief Wheaton?
Thank you. I think in terms of convening power, it's always helpful to get together and have those conversations. But I think the risk is always delay in making those things happen. In terms of source water protection, no, I think that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Okay, and quickly, my time is running out, but I know that there were 2 drafts circulated prior to introduction, and I know that the First Nation Advisory Committee was able to see these drafts. Did you put forward any suggestions that were either in full or in part, seen in the second iteration of the bill?
I can say that the bill that we're looking at today is fundamentally different from the first iteration of the bill that we saw. And so we were able to look at the 2 previous iterations and make many suggestions to help improve the bill. And as a result of that, as you'll see from our written submissions, we think that this version of the bill, with the amendments we've suggested, does a good job.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Le prochain, je vais donner la parole.
Now I'll be giving the floor to Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses. My first question will be on the advisory committee. A question for Chief Wetong McInnes. First of all, it's a pleasure to see you again and to
soit fait. Je serais curieux d'abord de vous poser comme question, le projet de loi C-61 a été déposé bien avant la visite du rapporteur spécial sur les droits de l'homme et son rapport qui date du mois d'avril 2024 où il implore le gouvernement du Canada de renforcer ses efforts à garantir le droit à l'eau potable aux communautés autochtones. L'emploi de l'expression « faire de son mieux » est ce qui a trait au versement du financement, apparaît comme une échappatoire et non comme une garantie que l'argent sera suffisant et un engagement qu'il sera à la fois stable et prévisible. Est-ce que vous pensez donner un amendement au projet de loi C-61 pour s'assurer que le gouvernement ne fasse pas que son mieux, mais qu'il puisse s'assurer de garantir que l'argent sera suffisant, stable et prévisible?
Chair, I'm so sorry. The translation went out halfway through, and I have no idea what the question is. My apologies.
We're going to quickly pause to make sure that we can address the translation problem, and I'll be sure, Monsieur Lemire, je vais vous donner plus.
Mr. Lemire, I will give you more time. I'm going to continue to speak French. Can you hear the English?
D'accord.
Yes.
Je vais.
Okay. Mr. Lemire, I'm going to give you the floor to start again. Thank you. So, yes, I was speaking to Chief Wetong McInnes that I was happy to see again and happy to be able to have this discussion in a formal environment where we'll be able to share her story. So C-61 was tabled well before the special reporter on human rights made his visit in April 2024, where he asked the Government of Canada to step up its efforts to guarantee that Indigenous communities have access to drinking water. And they use the term do all that they can in terms of funding. But I think that this is a sort of escape instead of ensuring that there will be sufficient funding and a predictable, sustainable funding. So would you suggest that there should be an amendment to the bill so that the government is not simply doing all that it can, but ensuring that there will be sufficient, sustainable funding for clean water for Indigenous groups and First Nations? Thank you.
Thank you. I could hear at that time. It through the chair, lovely to see you again as well. The question is there sufficient strength or is an amendment needed to strengthen the financial supports for access to clean drinking water? And the answer is yes. An amendment to ensure that it is the actual cost of access to clean drinking water would absolutely improve the legislation. However, I don't think that that's an impediment to getting started. I think my hope is that any government, any party who forms the government will see that that's a necessary commitment in the future and make that happen. Possibly naive, but definitely, and if there's time and room for an amendment to make that stronger, that would be very appreciated. Miigwech, thank you.
I would like to pay tribute to your commitment as a chief in Curve Lake pertaining to the specific situation in Curve Lake. Are there communities that will never be linked up to a water system or a wastewater treatment system, and what should we plan on for them? So Curve Lake is an excellent example to highlight here in the committee to show that, amongst other communities, some people do not have access to quality water. So some communities regularly do not have access to drinking water. So what would we need in the bill to cover these services and to prevent this lack of clean water or cutoffs from this water?
That's, I think, a very complicated question. I think there's 259 First Nations were covered by the Clean Drinking Water class action that we started. All of those 259 First Nations, those who have accepted the settlement agreement, are entitled to access to clean drinking water. That being said, there's over 600 First Nations in Canada, and absolutely there is a real risk that without legislation like this, there would be First Nations who do not get access to clean drinking water. I think there are many creative solutions that can be applied to ensure that every Indigenous individual living on Indian Reserve lands has access to clean drinking water, whether that's a community with point-of-use systems or an overall community water treatment system. I think that those solutions need to be found, and every Indigenous person in Canada should have an opportunity to have access to clean drinking water. Thank you.
On s'entend que c'est un débat.
We can agree that this is a complex debate, as you said. Many times we think that this happens in very remote or rural areas, but this is not necessarily the case. It's not the case for Curve Lake. So what we're requesting is an investment from the federal government, that they take responsibility in this. Because we can't make the inhabitants of Curve Lake, for example, pay the bills for this. So are there other opportunities other than, or we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to access this water. So what is the federal government's responsibility in this? What are your expectations from the federal government? And how can Bill 61 help? And how is it not able to help?
I think what I've seen over the last several years of being involved in the water class action is that the federal government has taken the responsibility for access to clean drinking water for Indigenous individuals on Indian Reserve lands. And that assumption of authority and jurisdiction many, many, many decades and hundreds of years ago means that it's a situation that the federal government is required to fix. And I think that's what my fellow witnesses and I are here to address today, is that need to start a solution. And I fully appreciate that this legislation is a beginning. It has commitments to ongoing annual reports and an investigation into every year how effective the legislation has been. And to go from a starting point of many communities, most First Nations in Canada not having access to clean drinking water, to a place of legislation that enables access to some for clean drinking water will lead us as Canadians, as Canada, to a place where Indigenous people can turn on the tap and have confidence that they will be healthy after they consume that water or bathe in that water. So I recognize and appreciate that this is a starting point, and I think optimistically it's a great place to start. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci,
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
And for our last round of questioning in the 6-minute round, we'll turn the floor over to Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for this very important discussion. I want to begin with you, Chief Wetang McInnes, as a mother. We talk about safe and clean drinking water, but the right to have water that provides the dignity that children are entitled to. I represent communities, and I've seen communities that on the government's list of safe drinking water, they're on there, but they have to pump so much chlorine into the system because the pipes are old, they're dirty, there's so much organics in there that by the time the water reaches the bathtub, it damages the skin in such a way that we have children with horrific levels of black eczema all over them. And I remember a beautiful young girl with incredible long hair who told me she didn't like to wash her hair because it burned her scalp. What do we need to do to make sure that what is considered clean water is actually water that protects and gives the dignity that mothers and children and families have an innate right to?
Thank you. Through the chair, I think the answer is is fairly simple. We need to provide the actual cost of operating and maintaining water treatment systems. And I think in its simplest form, that's what this comes down to is the actual cost of replacing outdated equipment, the actual cost of maintaining equipment, the actual cost of figuring out what's wrong with a system that you have to pump that much chlorine into it. And it feels very much, after many decades of living through this, like a political issue. We need the federal government to find the financial support to make these things happen.
Whole issue of adequate cost. I mean, I guess I'm a little cynical. I've been dealing with water issues for a quarter century, and I'm always wary of government making a promise. It seems they download the responsibility to the communities without giving the resources. Mr. Paul, I'd like to ask you on that. Neskantaga First Nation is in a land of beautiful lakes, and yet they've gone 28 years without clean drinking water. And if you go to Neskantaga, they have a brand new water treatment plant. But the pipes are all rotted. And I was trying to figure out, again, how is it possible that we could build a water treatment plant in a community without clean water and they still don't have it? And they said it was the same as if you put a new engine into a rotting Ford that's out by the side of the highway and tell people to drive. What is it going to take to ensure that we have the adequate funding in place to make sure that the whole life cycle of water and the infrastructure is there to guarantee the rights that people have?
I think in our perspective from Atlantic Canada, one of the important things that we saw was taking control over the jurisdiction of water through the creation of our own water authority that would take on the control and take on the full responsibility for water in all our communities that become part of the water authority. And one of the things in that jurisdiction and control through our water authority, it's about making that commitment, both financially and on the ground, that safe drinking water is going to be provided to every community from now and 25 and 30 years into the future. That includes from the source to the house and every step in between, and adequately figuring out the resourcing and the expertise required to make sure we have equity between our communities and our non-Indigenous brothers, basically.
So when you see, we always see the government making their big announcements of water. It doesn't seem like most of the money gets out the door. But it's about ending boiled water advisories. You can end a boiled water advisory. You can stand at the plant and say, check it out, it's clean, and nobody's drinking that water. And you know what? The media can't fly up to places like Cat Lake and Neskantaga to check that the public's being lied to. What's the disconnect between the real costs and what they're promoting?
I think there's a disconnect in terms of creating that detailed regulatory regime which does make the connection from the source to the end tap at the house. Because if those connections are not made clearly and defined in the costing regime, including the regulatory regime that exists, it's the only way to close all those gaps to actually produce quality water at the other end, whatever the situation. And using available technology and expertise that is available to do that. There is a cost to do that, and that's what you have to pay. You can't get a space shuttle to the moon without actually paying the cost. It's the same as water and wastewater.
I'm running out of time here. Vice Chief Pratt, I want to ask about the provinces, because one of the issues is that communities I represent are postage stamped size reserves. So yeah, we'll deal with the water there. But if a project goes on or there's damage to the watershed, those communities have to go through enormous legal battles because the province does not take the issue seriously. What is the concern the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations about protecting not just source water but watershed and protecting the rights of the water that is in your traditional lands?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honorable member for the question. Definitely, it's a huge concern here in Saskatchewan. Of course, it's very public and common knowledge that we have had some challenges with the current Mo Stas Party government. We're working our best to try to improve the relationship and the situation. But there are a number of huge outstanding issues around the natural resource transfer agreement with Canada, otherwise known as the Constitution Act, as well as the announced Diefenbaker irrigation project that is going to severely impact the flow of the water through the Qu'Appelle, which is where my First Nation sits, as well as the inland Cumberland Delta at Cumberland House, which is, I believe, the third largest inland delta in the entire world, with over 160 million species of birds.
Mr. Pratt, I'm sorry, we're running over time. If you could just wrap your answer up. Sorry.
Yep, huge issue. Basically, we will have lots of challenges with the provinces, and I think that's something that we all need to be concerned about around this. Is we have to make sure that the jurisdiction question is answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angus. We're now moving into our second round of questioning. I'm noticing that for this next round, I'm just going to add 1 minute to all of the interventions here, rather than to have a very abridged third round. So starting with Mr. Shields, I'm going to pass you the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you for the witnesses being here. One of the things that I think is important is to hear from a variety of witnesses, especially the variety of stories we do hear. Some may say, well, we hear some of the same things, but I think they're all told in different ways. So for all three of you representing today, one of the things we have heard is a lot of requests to appear here. How important is it for us to hear all the voices that want to speak to this issue? How important is it? Let's start with the top. Mr. Paul?
I would say it's very important, but I also say the legislation and getting the legislation done is just as important. And I think that, this has been a discussion which has been going on for quite some time, and I think it does need to get to an end. And I think it's really important that we get this done for our people and for our communities.
Thank you. Chief Pratt, Vice Chief Pratt.
I think it's very important. I think that that when you look at the current challenges around water, it's no secret. So I think it's important that we do this work, and I want to acknowledge the committee too as well. I think if we can get some amendments done, Mr. Chair, and to the honourable member, I think we stand a good chance of supporting this within our region. It would take, of course, another mandate, but we want some amendments to be done to this, and I think it's important that those amendments be made. Once those amendments are made, I think there would be no problem with the 7 First Nations in Saskatchewan getting behind this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Chief Wheaton.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think it's important that you hear the voices, but I agree with Chief Paul. It's important that you keep this moving. And when we started the class action, we went out to the regional chiefs bodies and the Assembly of First Nations, and we asked for support for this. And I think that you have a huge amount of support right now to get started. And I think if we're going to start here and we're going to continue to build on the legislation and make changes in order to get it right, I think that a starting point is significant and important. And I think that you've heard from many organizations now and have a few more days of hearings and witnesses to get that feedback. And if we can incorporate that feedback and move this forward quickly, I think that that's incredibly critical. Thank you.
The question I would ask next, because I think it's very clear what you've talked about as amendments, and all three of you, as the legislation sits today, because there's been actions, legal actions, threats of legal actions, as the legislation sits today, as it is, would there be, in your opinion, legal action if it didn't get changed? Mr. Paul?
I think it's critically important to get this done. And I think that a legal option is always an option to somebody whenever it is. And I just believe it's so important to get this done. It is now a priority to get it done. We should get it done, basically.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chief Pratt.
I think it's important that we get it done, but we want to get it done right. I think we cannot. The status quo is unacceptable. I think that and I want to commend the federal government for taking the initiative to try to fix an outstanding, long-standing issue within First Nations communities across this country. But I think that with the amendments made, I don't think there'll be any issue with getting the broad support or the majority support for this to proceed. And it's not to no disrespect to the committee that's been involved in this for all the great work that you've done, and we do acknowledge that. Thank you.
Chief.
Yes, thank you. I think that the question I would have is litigation over legislation has never stopped the government before, and I watch litigation take place over all sorts of legislation. I think the one that comes to top of mind is the Indian Act and the Indian status provisions. And I think every government for the last 30 or 40 years has had an opportunity and a court case and made changes to that. So I would hate to think that good legislation, acceptable legislation, would be passed over because there might be litigation over it. I think if you can make the amendments quickly and pass better legislation, that's more ideal, but I certainly hope that the potential litigation wouldn't stop the government from governing. Miigwech.
Okay. Thank you very much to our witnesses and to everyone who contributed. And Chief Wheatung, good to see you again. I know the importance of this conversation, and I'll be very quick on what I need to do here. But based on the conversations we're having today about the importance of C61, based on the fact we just had support for an emergency debate tonight in the House of Commons, and looking forward to the agenda for the first couple months of this session of Parliament, I just want to quickly table my motion or read my motion and have a very brief, if not quick vote on this if we could. I think it's extremely important. I'll read it here quickly for the committee. That the committee invites the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, the Minister of Northern Affairs Canada, and the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations to appear individually before the committee for no less than 2 hours each within 14 days of the adoption of this motion in relation to their priorities for the return of Parliament and their mandates. So thank you very much for the chair, and I do apologize to our witnesses, but I think it would be nice to have the ministers here to talk about this and many more topics.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmale, for providing notice, and I understand 48 hours notice. Is there any debate on this motion right now? I see Ms. Atwin, you have your hand up. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just for me, it's the timeline piece. We do have urgency around C61. We have more witnesses we want to call and speak to. And so it's that 14-day time period that's being presented. We will be hearing from the ministers on this bill. And so I think that's, this is the minister's priority. I know that certainly firsthand as her parliamentary secretary. So I would just be open to tweaking. I don't think I could support it as it stands because, again, I see it as actually delaying our work on C61 when I know that is her priority that she would come to speak to us about. I know certainly there's other opportunities that could come after C61. We would love to hear that as well in relation to the estimates. I think that would be a better use of our time. I wanted to put that out there for the committee to discuss.
Okay, are there any others that would like to get involved in the debate here? Monsieur Lemire, je vais vous donner la parole.
Mr. Lemire, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion is not showing up necessarily at the right time. I do agree that this is urgent and we need to move forward on C61 for access to drinking.
À nos ministres pour pouvoir les questionner sur l'ensemble des priorités, particulièrement dans le contexte actuel du Parlement fédéral. je serais curieux de voir si on serait capable de peut-être s'entendre sur une rencontre dans laquelle on pourrait...
Pardon, Monsieur le maire, on n'a pas la traduction. Je vais continuer à parler, peut-être...
I'm going to keep speaking. Can you hear me?
We're back. Monsieur le maire.
C'est lui.
Sorry, Monsieur le Maire. If you could start again. No problem, Mr. Chair. And you speak French very well, so always happy to hear it. So I was saying that this motion is a little bit premature in my opinion. I do agree that we urgently need to pass Bill C-61, but we need to debate it and we need to make the necessary recommendations to guarantee that First Nations have access to clean drinking water. I'd be curious as a discussion point to suggest that maybe we bring all the ministers together for one meeting. Of course, it's never a waste of time. The goal, this is the basis of our parliamentary system, but I hope that we could meet with all of these ministers that have been suggested, and I'm wondering if that would be supported by all my colleagues. I'd like to hear from the Conservatives.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le maire.
Thank you, Mr. le Maire.
Your hand up, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
It's a new sound system here. I agree with Sebastian and Janek. I agree with. Shall I continue speaking? I agree with people who are concerned about this issue. They want to see the ministers report to us about C. Thank you.
Pardon me, we're going to have to take a quick break again because now we're not getting English translation. We're going to...
We are...
Colleagues, I'm calling this meeting back to order. We were just in the midst of having debate on the motion that was brought forward by Mr. Schmale, and Ms. Idlout has the floor. I'll turn it over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. Given the technical difficulties that we're having, I'll speak in English for now. As I was trying to say in Inuktitut, I am not understanding the timing of this motion, given how important it is that First Nations have been waiting for a bill like this, given that there are too many boil water advisories, too many investments, too many of Indigenous people's rights that are not being respected. To interrupt this important study didn't make sense to me. However, based on my conversations with others, I am willing to consider an amendment to the motion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Monsieur Lemire, je vois votre main, et après ça,
Mr. Lemire, I see your hand is up, followed by Ms. Atwin. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would like to make a formal suggestion that we reduce the scope of this to just one meeting, but that all ministers be present, because this study may drag out several weeks longer. And so I think that we could quickly organize this meeting with the ministers, because this is very concerning for Indigenous communities. And so I think it's important that we meet with the ministers very quickly without pushing this back too far.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Next, I have Ms. Atwin and then Mr. Schmale.
Well, I was wondering if that was a formal amendment that Mr. Lemire is proposing. If not, I would like to amend the motion with the following. That the committee invite the Ministers of Indigenous Services Canada, the Minister of Northern Affairs Canada, and the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations to appear before the committee for no less than 2 hours following the study of the First Nations Clean Water Act in relation to their priorities for the return of Parliament, their mandate, and supplementary estimates B, should the study conclude after they are tabled. I can send that around in both official languages.
Point d'ordre, si vous me permettez, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. It was read very quickly, and the interpreter was not able to complete the interpretation because she did not have the text. But what I would add is that this would be, the meeting with the ministers would be after we finish the study of Bill C-61.
Monsieur Lemire, je n'étais pas sûr si...
Mr. Lemire, I wasn't sure if you'd like to formally propose an amendment or if you were participating in debate. It's an amendment. So you propose this amendment before Ms. Atwin? So if you have this in written format, that would be better. Otherwise, I know that Ms. Atwin has something that she would like to move forward with.
Certainly he could do a verbal amendment, but it would just be easier if we have that written out, or if the analyst...
Instead of 3 meetings each to 1 meeting. That's all it was. Okay. Which we're supportive of. So we could probably pitter-patter here.
D'accord. C'est...
Okay. If that is Mr. Lemire's amendment, we will debate on the amendment. Is there debate on the amendment?
Mr. Schmel.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the amendment from the Bloc and the NDP as well. We agree that C-61 is extremely important, and we do want to get it done as fast as possible and do the due diligence here. So we will accept the amendment as presented, that the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, the Minister of Northern Affairs, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations appear before the committee for no less than 2 hours. It's 1 committee meeting within 14 days of the adoption of this motion in relation to their priorities for the return of Parliament and their mandates.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Atwin.
I just believe that Monsieur Lemire added as well that it was to take place after the end of the study, so it's not that 14-day time period. If we could just get some clarification on that.
I understand there's some confusion here of the two. I was under the impression that Monsieur Lemire moved a motion to have it to be 1 meeting and then also for it to be after C-61. Before? Okay.
He was speaking to Jenica's amendment.
Excusez-moi.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. There were 2 negatives in French, which makes it a positive, so I'll try to be more clear. I think that in the circumstances, given that the study will take the majority of the fall, if we could cover other subjects, I'd be open to doing it as quickly as possible. So within 14 days after the motion be adopted, that we have this meeting so that we see the ministers as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have, I see a thumbs up, but do we have anybody else that would like to get involved in the debate here? Okay. Well, then I will call this to a vote. just to be clear, this is on amending the motion.
Mr. Baptiste. Mr. Carr. Mr. McLeod. Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Yes.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Schmale.
In favor.
Mr. Zimmer.
In favor.
Mr. Shields.
Favor.
Mr. Leipert.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
Oui.
Ms. Idlout.
Angyak po nga. Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
11 yeas, no nays.
Okay, so the motion is thereby amended. Is there any debate on the motion as amended before we get to a vote? Okay, I will call this to a vote.
Mr. Baptiste. Mr. Carr. Mr. McLeod. Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Yes.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Schmale.
In favor.
Mr. Shields.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer.
Yes.
Mr. Leipert.
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire.
En faveur.
Ms. Idlout.
Angyak po nga. Yes.
11 yeas, no nays.
Okay, the motion is adopted. So back to the matter at hand. We will be going to our second questioner in the second round of questioning. I have Mr. McLeod. We're going to go back to 5 minutes, just given that we are quite a bit over time, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that have joined us today. Very important subject. I'm from the Northwest Territories, and in my former life, I was a minister with the government of Northwest Territories, and one of my responsibilities was to provide a review of the drinking water situation in our communities. We don't have reserves, but we have indigenous communities, public communities that are not reserves. And when we took a look at 27 of them, we found quite quickly that there was a number of challenges. First of all, pretty much every water treatment plant was designed and built in a different country. So it made it really challenging to get parts, and it also made it very challenging to share parts because the neighboring community might have parts, but it wasn't the same model as what was in the other community. So, we saw that there was a need to make sure all the water plants were made from the same, through the same company, with the same design, so we could, first of all, get parts easier and share parts easier, and also design maintenance program with the people that built these facilities and lock them into contracts with us so that they could provide training for our membership. And it was very difficult. In some cases, there was a clean source of water, but the government would still insist on building a well because the certification for a well operation was less than getting from the surface water from the lake or from a river. So there was all kinds of things that were happening. In many cases, the source of water was a huge distance away, and when you're talking 20, 30 kilometers away from the source water to the community, it becomes a challenge. And governments want to just put in a water truck to run back and forth rather than build an expensive pipeline. And that was a challenging. And to have proper testing training is another area that was really difficult to find people to do it and to hang on to people that were trained. So many things were were brought forward as issues and challenges. When I was growing up, I live on the Mackenzie River, and I still live on the Mackenzie River, but when I was growing up, we'd be able to go out in our canoe and drink water right from the river. You can't do that now. The water's dirty. It's not safe, and so there's lots of things that are out there facing the Indigenous people, and the big thing is to have capacity to be able to run your own operation and to have the resources to do that. The intention of the bill is to ensure that there's access to clean water, there's a adequate supply, and it's. I think the intentions are really what got my attention on this. And however, I wanted to ask if all of you feel that the measures in the First Nations Clean Water Act could support the Indigenous community's ability to build capacity when it comes to operations, when it comes to maintenance and training water treatment plants. That's my first question.
Capacity is a critical part of creating, own, and operating these systems and over a long period of time. One of the challenges that many of our communities ran into a number of years ago, that everybody wanted to move to Alberta because of the wage differential in terms of water operators in Alberta. And I think that working closely with the communities, one by one, with a systematic approach to training and certification and commitment by people to stay in their communities for a long period of time is really the foundation of having a system and a process that can work over decades. And having your people trained locally in the community on the system that's there in terms of consistency across systems is really another thing. And one of the things that we're dealing with in our communities is trying to achieve that level of consistency across communities in both the engineering and design to ensure that an operator from community A can work in community B and community C. Because there has to be a group, enough people basically, to make sure as systems grow and challenges arise, that people are dedicated and committed to stay with what it is they're doing. And with our communities, working closely with all of them, that's been one of the biggest fundamental commitments that our chiefs have made to our water operators, is to ensure training, but also ensure ongoing training, because the skills you need now will not be the skills you require the next decade. And that is critical if these systems are going to last the entire life cycle of the system itself, and for the benefit of each and every community that does deserve equality across communities in terms of safe water and safe systems that last, basically.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Le prochain, j'ai Monsieur Lemire pour une minute et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais poursuivre avec la chef émérite.
I will be asking my questions to Chief Whitten McInnes. In our conversation, you talked about the situation at Curve Lake. It's been decades, maybe 40 or 50 years, since the project for a filtration plant has existed, but the problem is who's going to pay to build it. Of course, it would have cost a lot less if we were able to have done it 10 years ago or several decades ago, but unfortunately, for Curve Lake, this has been dragged out. Fortunately, this is something that can still be done, but in your opinion, who should pay for this? Is this the federal government's responsibility?
This is absolutely the federal government's responsibility, and thank you for that question through the chair. I think that I've seen over the history that Canada as a government has taken responsibility for Indigenous people and Indians under the Indian Act, and the Constitution speaks to Section 92, Indians and the lands reserved for Indians are the sole responsibility of the federal government. So this is a federal issue that needs to be resolved. And I'd just like to take a moment. I think one of the questions that has been asked today is the urgency of having this legislation, even if it's not perfect. And I think I've come to terms with the fact that we can't find perfect legislation the first time, but we need to legislate and enhance this basic human right now, knowing that the legislation might not cover all aspects of all things for all Indigenous people on all Indian reserves, because if we don't start now, the consequences are extreme. There is an election in October 2025 and possibly sooner. And if we don't entrench this legislation for Indigenous rights to clean drinking water now, the consequences of those delays will be felt by every Indigenous person who lives on an Indian reserve in Canada. And those consequences will be felt more by Indigenous mothers who suffer the consequences of not being able to care for their infant children in the way that every other Canadian gets to. So thank you for the question.
If I could ask one more quick question, a yes or no question. Do you think that the provisions in the bill should consider that wastewater treatment, water treatment is an essential service, which would mean that this is an immediate obligation for the government?
Yes, provided it doesn't delay the passing of the legislation.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire. For
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
questioner, I'll be turning the floor over to Ms. Ilaut for 2.5 minutes.
Given that it is my first opportunity to speak to the witnesses, I thank you for having appeared before this important study. As I've mentioned, I am quite aware that First Nations have been waiting a very long time for this bill to come as is. It's unfortunate that it doesn't go far enough. With my assessments, I've also noticed that it needs to see some major amendments to make sure that First Nations rights are being upheld. My first question will be to Emily, I believe, who mentioned to me to the committee that you were part of the class action, and I wonder if you can share with us, given the concerns that we've heard since this bill was first tabled, that jurisdiction, the language around jurisdiction is not strong enough. Do you have any recommendations that needs to amend the bill so that jurisdictions for First Nations can be stronger?
Thank you through the chair to Ms. Idlaut, and thank you for speaking English. It's wonderful to hear your language on the committee, but appreciate that you have made accommodations for us. I believe your question is the language around jurisdiction something that should stop this legislation? And I don't think that it is. I think that there are review periods built into the legislation every 5 years in order to make sure that we're moving it in a good direction, reports and reevaluations. And I think that that's one thing that can be fixed over time. Thank you.
Just to clarify, that's not what I was asking, but what I hope to see in the amendments is that when First Nations do get their jurisdiction back, because First Nations jurisdiction over water was stolen from them through colonization. So to take it back is such an important process of reconciliation. I'll ask this question this way. When you read the legislation the way it is, are there any concerns that you have regarding jurisdiction that would make it difficult for First Nations to exercise their jurisdiction?
I think that it is historically always difficult for First Nations to exercise their jurisdiction, but I think that this starts to give some of that back to First Nations, where we can create our own bylaws about water and access to water in our communities. And it's certainly by no means perfect, but it definitely is a starting point in that direction.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout, and I do want to thank all of our witnesses for joining the committee today in person and by video conference. Your testimonies absolutely enriched our study of this, and I just want to thank you very much for making the time today and also for being flexible as we're working through a number of things in our committee. So with that, we are going to suspend briefly and return in camera, and then I'd like to excuse the witnesses today.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.